Hello, everybody. My name is Jodi Schweitzer, Water Program Director with the Farm Bureau of Ventura County. I'll let Amy
I'm Amy Storm with Larry Walker Associates, and we manage a lot of the monitoring and reporting parts of the VCAL program.
So we're recording this video as a resource for growers to help develop a Track 1 monitoring and reporting plan. So this is if you've chosen Track 1 for your TMDL compliance pathway, where you will be doing edge of field sampling to demonstrate compliance with any TMDL that has exceeded after that compliance date. Growers who choose that compliance pathway are required to develop this plan within 6 months of notification. So Amy and I are going to walk through the plan today. We're going to walk through first the template that the regional board staff have put together for growers, and then the ways that we have added to that template and provided some additional guidance to help make it even easier for folks. So what you can see here on the screen is the regional board's template. And then any place that is color coded is an area where we have added additional language that's coming from VCALG's monitoring and reporting plan, which might give you kind of a step up in your own, or maybe some guidance or additional information from the ag order. So I'll go through the color coding first, and then we can start walking through this template. So anything in this blue color is language that we have pulled over from VCALG's monitoring and reporting plan and inserted into the appropriate section of this individual monitoring and reporting plan template. And that's for you to decide whether you want to use it or remove it if you would like to insert your own language. But just available there for anybody who chooses. Anything in green is just additional guidance or an explanation to help clarify what the regional board is asking for in a particular section. And then anything in this pink color is something that was included in the regional board's template. So it was listed as a requirement to include the template, but the requirements listed in the ag order might differ from that. So we'd recommend that for those particular section, folks refer to the ag order and help use that as guidance to determine what to include in your individual farm specific monitoring and reporting plan. And then lastly, anything in yellow, this is sections straight from the ag order, Appendix 3, Section 3.3.1, which is the section that lists the requirements of an individual monitoring and reporting plan, where we have copy and pasted that language right from the ag order. So if you see something in this purple color, that might point you to look for the yellow highlighted text to be able to compare and contrast what's listed in the template as required versus what's listed in the ag order as required. And Amy, do you have any other comments you want to add to that?
I think that's all for now. We also included some things that are copied from VCAL that aren't necessarily highlighted in that teal blue color, but are ways that we tend to organize like our field logs and record keeping kind of structure. So the regional board had some ideas in there, and then the VCAL template is obviously a lot more intensive because we're required to report on a lot more different measurements and observations than you are, but there's different ways to organize things, so feel free to play around with what works well for your brain and your own record keeping.
Great. I just want to also highlight the disclaimer that we have right here. So this template was provided by the regional board, and not all components are necessarily required by the ag order. So that's where that pink highlighting comes into play. For the exact regulatory language, refer to ag order appendix 3, section 3.3.1, which is included at the end of the document, highlighted in yellow per the color coding key. Also note that once you have completed your template and you're ready to submit it to the regional board, make sure that you've removed all of the color-coded highlighting text that is, just kind of the guidance and recommendations. Take that out before you finalize and submit your monitoring and reporting plan. So starting on page 1, this is pretty self-explanatory. You're just going to list the APNs and it's listed as APN 10, so that is the 10-digit format of the APN that your monitoring and reporting plan covers. So all of the parcels that make up your farm or ranch, you're going to list all of those on top. You're going to say who prepared this monitoring and reporting plan. So if you're doing it yourself, then you would put your own name in there. And you can take off the second section. If you have a consultant or somebody else helping you do it, they would put their name here and they are preparing it for you as the grower or landowner on your behalf.
One comment is it's not necessarily every single APN that you have enrolled in VCalc. So one quick thing to do is to refer to that notification packet that VCalc sent you that lists the parcels that that are required to comply with either track 1 or track 2, or you could look at what you submitted in your NOI as the parcels you identified there. So it may be a subset of your ranches.
And that's, I think, a good point to kind of point out some other references here. So I had mentioned the language. Anything that is highlighted in blue color is something that was brought over from VCalc's MRP. If you want to see the entire MRP, you can go to the Farm Bureau webpage, click on VCalc. This is our main VCalc landing page. Scroll down where you see documents, and we've got the monitoring and reporting plan. So if you click on this link right here, it's going to take you to a PDF copy of the entire VCalc monitoring and reporting plan. And then the other resource that's going to be helpful to have handy is your notification packet. So this is the letter that most folks received. If you're in the Cayugas Creek watershed area, we sent those for quite a few constituents at the end of February. So this is the letter telling you about the TMDLs that have triggered in your area, the parcels that are subject to those. So in your letter, you should see your parcels listed. And then the specific information about the VCalc monitoring sites that exceeded and what constituents they exceeded for. So we'll refer back to this when we get to those specific sections. So there's not much to update for some of these first couple of sections. A lot of just how to use the template and some introductory instructions. And then we get to the project personnel section. And Amy, do you want to describe what this is for?
Sure. So this is just kind of a little quick reference for who's going to be kind of carrying out and in charge of the monitoring that you'll be doing on your farm, and also the laboratory contacts that you'll be using. So the first two names, the operation manager, this is who you want to put in charge of making sure the monitoring is done and all the data is being received and collected and all the record keeping, whether it's photo documentation or those paper field log notes and everything are being kept so that you have that record to later report that to the regional board in your annual monitoring report. And this could be someone that you contract with, like a consultant, or it could be, um, the landowner themselves, a grower, um, any sort of field staff operator that you want to put in charge of this, or if you maybe have a compliance manager who does your food safety stuff, they might be a good person to choose to also manage this for you. And then the primary field sampler would be who you have going out and collecting those samples on the farm for you. And it could be the same person or it could be someone different. As far as the lab manager and lab QA officer, that's information that you'll get from the laboratory that you decide to contract with. And you'll need to add additional rows if you're using more than one laboratory. If possible, it's always easier to handle managing with just one lab, but depending on what constituents you need to measure, you may decide to go with a couple. So.
And so then moving on to section 2, this is the introduction, a lot of just kind of general language has been added by the regional board to describe who the regional board is, the Los Angeles region, agriculture in our area, and then the regulatory order, the ag order that was adopted in September of 2023, that this plan is being developed to comply with. And then it breaks it down into a couple of sections that are specific to your farm or ranch operation. So starting first here in section 3, a description of the agricultural operation. And this is where we have some general guidance as well. So VCALG recommends referring to the ag order language that's included at the end of the document to determine which information is required to be included in these sections, and then be able to determine what you would like to include there. You'll list the location of your farm or ranch, the VCALG responsibility area, the size, the land use, so what types of crops or cultivation practices are you implementing, and then any description of nearby water bodies. And again, to note that these are all elements of the template highlighted in this pink color to indicate that it's included in the template, but it's not necessarily included in the ag order language of what is required for an individual monitoring and reporting plan. Anything else to add to the description of agricultural operations, Amy?
No, I think that covers it. I think use your best judgment of what a site description is. How do you want to describe your operation?
Section 4 is your monitoring locations, the constituents, and sample collection. So this is where you're going to want to refer to that notification that you receive from VCALG, which shows, this is just an example of folks who are in the Arroyo Simi responsibility area. In this particular notification packet was specific to wet weather samples. So it's telling you wet weather samples for nitrate plus nitrite as nitrogen, as well as a wet weather sample for chlorpyrifos. So we know for growers who are responding to this particular notification, who have chosen track 1, they're going to develop a plan for sampling in wet weather because we only have wet weather exceedances, and then the analyses will be required for chlorpyrifos as well as nitrate plus nitrite as nitrogen. So you start with identifying the number and location of monitoring sites based on site-specific characteristics and supported by scientific rationale for your specific farm or ranch. So the sites must be adequate to characterize the majority of discharge from the agricultural operation based on typical drainage patterns, including tailwater discharge, discharge from tile drains, and stormwater runoff. So for this particular example for Arroyo Simi, it's a wet weather exceedance, so the focus would be on wet weather discharge from a farm or ranch. And put together just kind of an example of what a monitoring site plan, site map essentially could look like. So this doesn't have to be really fancy. You can grab an aerial image from Google Earth and just mark it up. So what we've done here is just grabbed an aerial image of 2 adjoining parcels. So this would be the example farm that this plan is being developed for. You would show the outline of the parcels and then the flow direction of drainage for a particular property. So for this map, we just threw on some flow direction arrows indicated in the key, what we're pointing out here, and then a few monitoring sites. So you can name the monitoring sites, whatever makes sense for you. For this particular example, we have it marked into a surface water, so SW1, where we have a drainage channel here, so you could sample at the edge of the drainage channel. SW2 for surface water 2, another drainage channel, so you'd want to sample at the end of that drainage channel. And then TW1 for tile water. So if you have a ranch that has tile discharge, you can sample at one site or whatever you think would be appropriate for your farm or ranch, um, and indicate these locations on the map. And I'll kick it to Amy to add any more context you think is important here.
Yeah, I think this is one of those areas where your in-depth site knowledge is really critical because looking at the map may really be deceiving. For example, SW1 may actually be completely inappropriate for this farm, and it's a drainage channel for the field that's to the north of it. We don't know. Um, Also, you may have different channels that aren't really observable, or shifts in where the elevation is, or modified drainage that you've done on your farm. And so I think maps are wonderful, but they can also be deceiving in terms of showing the regional board that you have enough or adequate monitoring locations. So you'll want to kind of write that in your monitoring plan to kind of justify what you're proposing. You also don't want to oversample. If you have a single location that is representative of your entire farm in terms of the crops that you're growing and any management practices that you've installed, you want to make sure you're trying to capture and characterize, like, hey, I have a grassed waterway upstream here, so you want to measure downstream of that to get the positive effects of anything that you've already done to reduce some of these constituents of concern that you may be sampling for. So think about your operation in terms of your crops, where water is draining, but also any good things that you've done. So you're basically getting credit for those practices in what you're monitoring and measuring and seeing those positive effects.
The other thing I just want to note, just kind of as a note for anybody who has tile drainage on their farm or ranch, is that this is a really tricky thing when it comes to individual farm level sampling because, as you all know, the tile system is many times interconnected in a very large network underground. And so, what's coming out of a particular outfall may not be caused by the ranch that it is daylighting underneath. It could be coming from a farmer ranch in the surrounding area, many acres of land in the surrounding area. So that's something that you'll want to note in your monitoring and reporting plan to clarify where you're sampling from and some of the uncertainty that might be around that particular source of water. And that's going to be at the regional board's discretion as to how they may consider some of those factors in their compliance determinations. Okay, so that's the site map. You'll also add the GPS coordinates of any of your sampling sites. And that's something that you can just get off of Google Earth. You pull up your farmer ranch, plot a point where you want to sample, and it'll tell you what the GPS coordinates at that site would be. I think that covers everything for section 4. Oh, a little bit more. Um, you will indicate the types of discharge that your farm even has. So if you have irrigation runoff, stormwater runoff, or tile drainage runoff, you would check that. You've already attached the map. We've talked about that. Again, some additional language highlighted in pink here where it's included in the template developed by the regional board, but not in the ag order. So not necessarily something that you would have to include. And then down to constituents monitored. So this is where referring to that TMDL notification letter packet would be very helpful. So table 1, the constituents to be monitored. For this particular example, again, we are monitoring for nitrate plus nitrite and chlorpyrifos.
And those are going to be measured separately, and you're going to have to sum them. So it'll be two analyses. for the nitrate nitrogen and the
Nitrate and
nitride
nitrite.
nitrogen.
And then your units would be milligrams per liter for nitrate or nitrite, and nanograms per liter or micrograms per
Micrograms.
liter for chlorpyrifos. Okay, sample collection. Amy, do you want to talk through this section?
Sure. So there's a lot of information on how you can do sample collection. Right here, they did include some handy things in terms of what you want to make sure is included on your sample label. So that's those first bullets there under the sample collection heading. You'll want to have some sort of, identifier of that sample that matches the location from your map so you know where that sample came from. And a lot of times the sample ID could be like a number and then maybe a location abbreviation with it. Um, One of the things to really keep in mind too is all of this is going to be tracked on your label and then matched with the document, the chain of custody that travels with it to the laboratory. So everything can be cross referenced and you have a record. And then that should also match your field log where you're writing down your record of, what samples that you took at a certain time or during a certain storm event. Um, it's one of those things where you can get a lot of this stuff from the lab. Typically, labs will provide pre cleaned bottles for you and even a blank chain of custody form for you to fill in and then return back with them with the filled samples. And a lot of times they'll be labeled as well. Depending on the lab, though, you may not have labels that you can use or that are fillable. So in that case, you'll want to make sure you buy waterproof labels. All of this stuff may be traveling like on ice, and it's bound to get wet in a storm. So make sure you have waterproof labels, or you may be very sad at not being able to read what your samples are, where they came from. So, for the quality assurance and quality control section, know that the labs are typically going to be handling, well, not typically, they will be handling all their internal quality control sampling in terms of doing their own lab duplicates and spikes and things to make sure that their samples are running according to their procedures. However, you may be wanting to do some field quality control. So in that example, field quality control samples would be field blanks, which is a measurement of looking at how cleanly you're sampling in the field. That's taking a bottle of blank water that's given to you by the laboratory. The lab will provide this, and then an empty bottle, and you are basically just going to uncap that blank water and pour it into the empty bottle and hope that you don't get any contaminants. That's checking for whether you're possibly contaminating that blank water in something you're doing, such as leaving a vehicle running and there's exhaust particles that could be getting in, or your gloves aren't clean and you're introducing dirt or something else, or maybe you set the lid of your bottle on the ground when you're sampling and then there's some dirt that then gets in when you recap it. So that field blank is measuring how well and how cleanly you're taking those samples. Now, field duplicates are looking at the water itself, and you're going to try to sample and collect 2 bottles of water as close to at the same time as possible. Now, I realize that with ag runoff and tailwater, you may just have a tiny trickle that you're trying to fill your bottle with. Or you may even be needing to use like a Ziploc bag or something in order to fill your bottle because it's not a very, strong or significant flow. But if possible, it's ideal if you can have 2 bottles that you're filling at the same time to get that field duplicate. They want to measure the concentration of whatever you're trying to analyze for and see what the difference is between those two concentrations. So we've been talking about doing like nitrate nitrogen. So what you would do is you would fill 2 bottles, and then both of those would be analyzed for nitrate nitrogen, and you want to see what the difference is between those two measurements. That's your field duplicate. I think that's
To
it for
just
those.
explain it in really layman's terms, the field blank, you're just like Amy said, you're getting a blank water sample from the lab, you're pouring it into bottles in the field, like you're just kind of mimicking what your sampling would be like. And then when the lab receives that and they analyze it, it should be blank. If it's not blank, if there's something in it, it means that there was some field contamination. And then likewise for the field duplicates, if you're collecting 2 samples at the same time, they should have right about the same level of nitrate in them. If they're off significantly, that also shows that there was something that could be a QC flag. Um, and then the next section here talks about equipment blanks and matrix spikes. So equipment blanks would be like the laboratory has their own blank that they're running through in the analysis, and they're making sure that there's nothing on the laboratory side that's introducing anything into your samples. And the matrix spike, and Amy can correct me if I'm describing this wrong, but they're going to spike it to a known concentration. So if it's like nitrate, they're going to spike a particular sample to 20 parts per million nitrate as nitrogen, analyze that, and then measure how close they got to that spike.
Yeah, an equipment blank could also be in the field if you're using extra equipment. So if you're, for example, if you're taking sediment samples and you're using like a little scoop and pouring that into your sample bottle, you may actually do a equipment blank on your scoop where you're pouring blank water over your shovel into a bottle. Or if you're using some sort of pump or extra containers like that, but that's probably not going to be typical for what we're doing here.
Okay, project task and schedule. Do you want to take that one too, Amy?
Sure, why not? Um, so the monitoring plans are supposed to be conducted starting 10 days after approval by the regional board. What they have said verbally to us is beginning maybe as simple as contacting your laboratory or requesting bottles for whenever the next sampling event is going to take place. But all of this is really at your discretion in terms of how you want to get organized and when you want to start. The only caveat being is if you're required, like this Oreosemi example that we're talking about, that responsibility area, their samples need to be collected in wet weather. So if you're getting approval and it's in the middle of the rainy season, you probably want to get started so that you can get your storm samples collected. However, if your MRP is approved during the summer, then you have some time to get ready and you don't need to rush too much. Um, Below we have a little schedule that you could possibly use where you basically list the constituents that you're sampling and how often. Go ahead and stay on page 12, Jody. So there's a little table there that you can kind of keep track. And this is another one where you'll just refer back to that notice of exceedance. So it's simply a matter of flipping over to the tables. I think it's attachment B of the notification. Yep, attachment B right there. And that tells you you're going to be measuring for nitrate nitrogen, nitrite nitrogen, and chlorpyrifos. And so you'll copy that right over for you. And you're also doing all of those in wet weather. So because we only have the wet weather exceedances there, all of your sampling frequencies are going to be 2 wet samples per year. And all that information, like I said, will come from your exceedance notification packet. For example, if it only said those exceedances happened in dry weather, then you're going to have all your constituents only sampled during dry weather. Now, if there were exceedances that were noted for wet weather and dry weather, then you're going to end up sampling 4 times per year. You'll have 2 dry weather irrigation time samples and 2 wet weather storm samples. The language below on the bottom of page 12 also gives you the specifics of when you should be sampling in terms of during a storm event and also during irrigation dry weather events as well. And that's from the ag order instructions. So I think we can go to the next page. And this has a little bit more of those specifics of what to consider when timing your sampling. On page 13, the table 2 was provided by the regional board as the template, and it has the dry and wet seasons. So those irrigation dry weather samples should be done, when you decide when you're irrigating between May 15th and October 15th. And then the wet season is considered between October 15th and May 15th. So those winter months. The table above that's in green, that's not something that's required, but something that we added that we thought could be useful for you in terms of just trying to organize what you have to do when and where. So a place for you to list all of your monitoring sites and some sort of description of them, as well as those coordinates, and then copy down those constituents that you're going to sample at each of the locations and note the frequency that you're going to be doing that sampling. So this is kind of a site-specific schedule that you may decide to use if it's helpful. Okay,
Section 6, this is where we really pulled a lot of information in from VCALG's monitoring and reporting plan.
yeah. So this is the field methods. In the template from the regional board, they simply instructed everyone to use SWAMP field methods. And there's a whole website for SWAMP. It's a
Can you define what
California
SWAMP is?
monitoring. State Water Ambient Monitoring Program. I've got that at a 90% confidence that that's about right.
I was thinking it was surface water, but you're probably right.
Oh, it might be Surface Water
Surface
Ambient
water.
Monitoring Program. Let's
Swamp.
Google. Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program. There we go. So there's a whole website for that if you're interested in looking at their guidance. They also have templates for QAPPs and things like that if you're interested. What we've gone ahead and done is just copied and pasted the general sampling techniques that VCALG uses for collecting grab surface water samples. And that's all listed here. And it does give you some of that information about ways to avoid contamination and then how to collect the sample itself. So, in terms of contamination, some of the things we noted before running vehicles, smoking, you want to make sure that any of your rain gear, like if you have a hood on, you're not leaning over the sample bottle and dripping into your bottle. No eating or drinking or leaving the bottle just out and open. You want to uncap it, fill it, and quickly. Another thing is making sure that you're rinsing bottles. Some of the bottles may have preservative in them, typically if you have to measure for ammonia or bacteria. So you don't rinse those bottles because you would just wash out the preservative. But everything else, you'll want to take a little bit of water, cap it, shake it, dump the water behind you. You're always going to do everything facing upstream so you're not stepping in a channel and then mixing up any sediment and introducing things to your sample. You want to stand either like straddling your channel or to the side of it and doing everything upstream. So you're collecting fresh or clean water that's coming down that hasn't been mucked up by your boots or anything else that you may have going on. The other thing to do is really evaluate your site when you first get there and determine if it's even appropriate to collect those samples. So that's where we have under that sample collection heading is kind of a quick evaluation of deciding should we take samples and making that decision. If everything is just sitting in a puddle and not leaving your property, if it's stagnant, you don't want to collect that. That's not actually a discharge that you are responsible for. However, if you are at your monitoring site and you see water coming down your channel and it's continuing past you, then you would be sampling that flow. Um, the other thing to make sure, especially when we're talking about those pesticide samples that we take, a lot of those pesticides, especially the legacy ones, they like to stick to the sediment particles. So when you're sampling, you really want to try to do that mid-flow. You don't want to have the edge or lip of your sample bottle getting into the dirt. You really want it up in the flow of the water because you may then be introducing those sediment particles that have those legacy pesticides stuck to them, and it's not actually, being transported at the moment. You want to collect what is flowing in the water. Um, there's also a section on intermediate containers. So sometimes if you need to fill a really big jar, the lip of that may be a little bit higher to where the depth of your flow is too low to allow that to flow in. So sometimes you can get smaller bottles from the lab or even use a really clean, like fresh Ziploc bag. That's kind of your last resort. But a bottle cleaned from the lab that's smaller that you maybe pour into a larger bottle is your best guess because it's been pre-cleaned by the laboratory. So there's instructions there if you fall into that situation. And then the most important thing is also your sample handling after you collect those samples. You want to make sure that you're keeping your samples on ice or in a refrigerator, especially when you're thinking about nutrients. Algae and things can continue to grow if they're left in the sun, and that may transform some of the nitrogen that's in your bottle. Um, there's other things, you don't want anything to change from those conditions under which you collected the sample. And so that's why um, we want to keep those on ice and or refrigerated throughout the collection time and the transport time until it gets to the laboratory. Do you have anything else to add, Jodi?
The only thing I would emphasize is this last step, which is completing your COC, which is your chain of custody form. And that's going to be your field log for noting down all of the samples you've taken, the time you took them, how you took them, any other information that might come in handy later to document things. Another important thing for documentation is take pictures. So if you're out there sampling, grab some field pictures too, because they might come in handy later on when the analyses come back and if there are any questions about what might have caused an exceedance or what the condition was specific to that sampling event.
I think that's a really important note. I think photos really help, and any notes you can say in terms of if you do happen to have irrigation runoff, noting maybe which field that was coming from, what was being watered at the time that the samples were collected. Um, Things like that can be really useful in providing that context of the results.
Right. Laboratory methods. I'll take this
So
one, Jodi.
everything for the lab, all we have to use accredited laboratories. So that means they're certified by MELAP or ELAP. And the information in the table to fill out on page 16 there, that's all information that will be provided by the lab in terms of their certification number and when it expires and things like that. The regional board in the template listed the analytical methods that they need to be either EPA standard methods or approved methods. and they give references for those. It can be kind of a beast to go through those documents and look all that up. So, what we've gone ahead and done is provided on page 17, we've provided all the constituents and analytical methods as well as their units and the method detection limits and reporting limits that were given to us by the labs that VCALC uses for our monitoring program. Now, those project method detection limits and reporting limits are not standard. Those are specific to the labs that VCALC is currently using. So you'll need to also get those numbers from the lab that you select. There is some flexibility in the analytical methods that can be used. And so, if you provide, say, this table and tell your lab what constituents you're required to test for, they may come back and say, oh, we want to use this standard method instead of the EPA method that's listed here. So, it's just a matter of you want to make sure that it is one of those EPA or standard methods that are approved, but it can be different than what is listed in this table. Um, that might be a little bit confusing.
That's another thing where the regional board themselves could also be a good resource. If you find a laboratory that you want to work with, they tell you what their analytical method is for nitrate as nitrogen, and maybe it doesn't match up with what VCALG is using with our laboratory here. You can always contact the regional board and ask them if that would be acceptable. Another thing for additional guidance on laboratories that VCALG has on our TMDL resources page, we have a handout for Track 1 laboratory resources. So this is going to list some of the local laboratories or laboratories that VCALG works with or knows about in the area who can do some of these analyses. It'll have the contact information for that laboratory, and it'll also list the constituents that they can analyze for and maybe some constituents that they can't. Some examples of constituents that not all laboratories are going to be able to analyze for are going to be some pesticides, because the detection limit that they have to analyze, be able to detect down to, is so incredibly low that only specialized laboratories can do that. So if it is a pesticide exceedance, then that might be something that's going to limit your laboratory options. Other things like nitrate, I think pretty much any lab you're going to find is going to be able to do that analysis. So that one's going to be a little bit easier.
Yeah, it might be worth, if you already have a relationship with a lab that you use for food safety, that might be an easy place to start too, in terms of asking them if they're capable of adding on the constituents that you may need for this. Just to simplify things and not necessarily have to add another contractor or another relationship that you need to build and figure out communication and things with. So that might be a place to start.
Okay, so this is just a continuation of that same table with some additional constituents and then the analytical methods. Um, and again, these are analytical methods that VCOG's laboratories are using to perform these analyses, and then the project method detection limit, and then the reporting limit. Data management and reporting. So this section right here is going through how you have to report the information after you receive those results from the laboratory. Um, and annual monitoring reports are due to the regional board each December. So after you have completed your sampling for the year, that following December, by December 15th, is when you would submit your annual monitoring report to the regional board. The template lists the elements that the annual monitoring report has to include, and then pasted here in the yellow highlighted text is direct from the ag order. The elements of the ag order says that an individual annual monitoring report must include. Anything else to add to that, Amy?
No, I think that's pretty straightforward. I think one of the things to remember though is you're going to want to make sure you have really good organized records of the monitoring that you do, because all of that is going to need to be compiled for your annual monitoring report. So the photos that you take, those field logs with the notes of what happened or what you did, everything like that. The chain of custody form that you submit to the lab, making sure you have copies of that. Usually they include that for you, a copy of the fully signed chain of custody with your lab results, with your report that you get back. But good organization is key to having an easy time putting together the annual monitoring report. So down here, we just have a few examples. We noted in green, those are the notes from VCAL, just little tidbits that we're providing. This is an example field log on page 22. And so this is, something that you could use, and you can also modify it to make it easy for yourself. Um, Another thing you could do is like pre-fill out the different sample numbers and measurements or what you're going to do, and then have that all ready for you. So it's all filled out, and then all you need to do is mark stuff off. And if that location happens to be dry, you can just, put a line through it and say that you didn't collect a sample, there was no flow or what have you. But once you have something set up that you can just print over and over, it's going to be less work for you out in the field. If you are taking these things, the paperwork out in the field with you, you might want to consider getting write in the rain paper to write on, so that if you're out there in wet weather, your paper isn't falling apart and disintegrating while you're trying to write things down. That can be a handy thing to use. On the next page, yeah, these are all kind of templates that you're free to use and populate on your own. On page 24, that's the VCALC field log sheet. As you can see, it's a lot more detailed than what's required for this individual monitoring program. But we just included it because this shows some of that pre-population that we did. So like the sample IDs are already filled in, the site location, GPS coordinates, the analytes or constituents that we're going to be testing for, those are already listed, so you can just check stuff off and write in like the time that you collected the sample. So this is obviously more detailed, but you can kind of see how having those things pre-populated for yourself can make things a little bit easier. And then that last section, everything from now on is just that section 3.1, 3.3.1 of the Ag Order Appendix 3. And this is that individual MRP requirement. So if you want to read in full what's required in this MRP document that you're producing right here, this is what the Ag Order regulatory language is exactly. So we put it here so you wouldn't have to go to the website, download the Ag Order, or find it somewhere else. It's just right here within the template so that you can easily refer to it as you're working on this.
And that wraps up the end of the template. So if there are any questions on this template, this is something that the regional board staff are more than happy to help answer, walk you through some additional information and provide some guidance as well as needed. If there are any other questions on the resources that VCALG has, or general questions about the template, feel free to contact VCALG at vcalg@farmbureauvc.com.